Good afternoon, and I'm Allison. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the National Susan B. Anthony Museum and House. We're really thrilled to have you all here. For those of us that are in the room, thank you for understanding. It's a little warmer in here than normal, but we're doing our best to keep you cool. And for those of you that are on Zoom, we're very happy to have you joining us today. Please feel free to send questions to the chat throughout the program. I'll make sure that they are answered. And for those of you that are in the room, we'll hold questions until the end. And if you could keep in mind that we do need to repeat the question so that those on Zoom can hear it, maybe giving us your questions if they're long and short. Segments would be helpful for us to repeat that. But I'm really pleased to welcome all of you to our May guest lecture. And it is my honor to introduce our president and CEO, Deborah Hughes, who has been at the museum for 18 years now. And she will be doing a presentation in honor of Nurses Week that we celebrated just last week. So I will turn things over to Deborah.
I know some of you have heard several different versions of nursing and Susan B. Anthony, or when nursing collides with Susan B. Anthony, or how Rochester is the cradle of nursing. I'm looking particularly at Judy, who's been a member of our nursing friends since 2009, almost as long as I've been here. Before I get started, I wanted to give you a couple disclaimers. One is that sometimes we're presenting facts. The fact that Susan B. Anthony was born in 1820. And sometimes we're presenting theories. And in the last 5 to 10 years, often we have found historians who talk about their theory as though those are facts. And then they get repeated by other people. And so I want to be really clear with you that I'm going to be sharing some facts, and I'm going to be sharing a lot of theory. So if you want to repeat anything I said, it's a theory, and like any science, it should be tested. This is one of the most exciting things that has been happening in the last 15 years, and one of the things that's really at risk right now, which is we are looking at history through the lenses of women from different perspectives of the 19th century. I say at risk because the recent firing of the Librarian of Congress, who's been making it possible for people across this country to access documents that are original documents, because they've had many, many crowdsourcing projects. We are reshaping and relearning and re-understanding history, and apparently that's threatening. So I just offer that up to say. And I do find that often, particularly in history, we will quote someone when they had a theory, but we are discovering documents that disprove those theories. One of the best examples, I think, is that for years and years, many of us would talk about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband Henry as though they didn't really get along, because someone said that once and everybody quoted her. Then a researcher in New York State found the letters between Henry and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and discovered they were court romantic. And contrary to the fact that had been asserted that he was never around when any of the 7 children were born, he actually was present and wrote all about it. So be open to hearing and learning new things, and don't believe everything I tell you. The second is that I come always with a bias. I come with a bias, and I just want to own those biases. The bias that I have here is one: I have a tremendous respect for Susan B. Anthony and for the people that she worked with. And I probably have read more history from the angles of people who also respected Susan B. Anthony and thought about her. Another is I happen to be a lesbian, and so I look a lot at 19th century history from those perspectives of picking up particular things. Some of you, I know, have a connection with the nursing profession. So that is another bias that I have, that I've inherited from the wonderful people in our nursing friends, to see and look for places where the profession of nursing is being mentioned, shaped, or impacted by what's going on. So I just want to put those up front so that you can be aware of that. But now let's plunge into these feminists and nursing. So this is my theory, and it's not mine alone. In fact, you can read in the History of Women's Suffrage, in the very first volume, about the feminists that were in support of the profession of nursing. I recently went to an event in Rochester, and it was wonderful. It was talking about Susan B. Anthony, and the person said, well, I'm using the word feminist, but they didn't use it then. That is not a fact, nor a theory. They were proud to call themselves feminists, and they're proud to call themselves radical feminists. Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass liked to wear that label. I wanted to give you a quote from the History of Women's Suffrage, from the introduction. And I recommend the first volume of the History of Women's Suffrage. The speeches that you will read in there by men and women, and the reflections by the editors, who were Matilda Joslyn Gage, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, are some of the most exciting revolutionary materials you will read from our history of this country. I do not recommend volume 4. It reads like Leviticus. It's just a lot of people went to a lot of conventions and all their names and all the numbers are in that book. But volume 1 is particularly exciting and challenging. And the introduction concludes with, over the civilized world, we find the same impelling forces and general development of society without any individual concert of action, tending to the same result, alike, rousing the minds of men and women to the aggregated wrongs of centuries and inciting to an effort for their overthrow. The works of George Sand, Frederica Bremer, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, Catherine Sedgwick, and Harriet Beecher Stowe in literature, Mrs. Hemans, Sigourney, Elizabeth Barrett Browning in poetry, Angelica Kauffman, Rosa Bonheur, Harriet Hosmer in art, Mary Somerville, Carolyn Henschel, Mary Mitchell in science, Elizabeth Fry, Dorothea Dix, Mary Carpenter in prison reform, Florence Nightingale and Clara Barton in the camp, are all parts of the great uprising of women out of the lethargy of the past and are among the forces of the complete revolution 1,000 pens and voices herald at this time. Well, when we start to think about the feminists of the 19th century, especially when we're talking about the woman suffragists, people often talk about the first wave of feminists. That is offensive to this particular history reader, because we're talking about 4 physical generations of women in that first wave of feminism, and they should all be looked at and addressed separately and understood separately from their context. Susan B. Anthony lived 86 years, and from the beginning of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, there was so much change. When you think about how much change can happen, how fast, I would just call your attention to the last 100 days. Always there's context for history. Always there's change. So always when we assert something, it's so helpful to really look into what was happening. So when we look at those early feminists, like Susan B. Anthony, and I mentioned she was born in 1820. So in New York State, we were 7 years away from ending the institution of slavery. But even that, people don't always realize that people who were still enslaved in New York, but had not yet reached the age of 20, were continued to be enslaved people in the state of New York. But notice those dates, because along with Susan B. Anthony, I would want to introduce you to Florence Nightingale, 1820 to 1910. Their lives were almost parallel. But Susan was saying someday will be heeded that all the freedoms women now possess, or did possess and now possess, have no idea how every single inch of ground that she stands on today has been gained by the hard work of some little handful of women of the past. When we look at the emergence of nursing as a profession, there were groups of handfuls. There were women, groups of women in a number of places who made remarkable change, and many of them were connected directly to Rochester. When we think about that first wave of these feminists, if we're calling the 19th century the first wave, but Mary Wollstonecraft and Abigail Adams would object, thinking they were feminists before that. It was a biracial movement. Sojourner Truth, born sometime between 1797 and 1880, we don't know exactly because the records aren't clear, also was in parallel with these women and was a generation older. Sometimes we think about Sojourner Truth as with her very famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, which is, of course, mischaracterized in the dialect of the South because she had a Dutch accent, since Dutch was her first language. Not everyone knows that Sojourner Truth was the first woman and the first Black woman to successfully sue in court of law to free her son, who had been sold after New York ended slavery, into slavery in Alabama. She was one of the people who Susan B. Anthony and the other early feminists were excited by and incited by. Another one was Harriet Tubman. Again, the same era, 1822 to 1913, in parallel with Susan B. Anthony and others. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was another wonderful radical. Susan B. Anthony and Harper frequently debated, and they can entertain us or engages in significant discussions about racism in this country by reading the debates that they had today. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a woman who was born free in this country and chose to engage in her feminist work despite the fact that she risked her status and her social position to do so. One of the things that all of these women had in common was a deep sense of faith, various connections with institutions that were religious, but they were radical in this notion of capturing what you can read in Genesis, that both men and women were created by God and created equal. We can't emphasize enough how radical that idea was. The Quakers added a whole nother radical idea to that, which was that no person, no priest, no church, no authority could stand between you and your relationship with God. Now that meant for those places that still had a monarchy that said that the king represented the Creator and the Almighty, or for those who still had church influence, they were turning the whole world upside down to suggest that women had the same value, quality as any other human being. In the 19th century, this was radical if you were a white woman. It was incredibly radical if you were a woman of color who was enslaved and who had been reduced to something different from acknowledging the humanity of a person. In 1850, something happened that radicalized a lot of this group of women, and that was the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act was in part implemented by the United States Congress because when we had stopped allowing people to be brought into the country enslaved, they were needing more people who could be enslaved to work the farms and till the plantations in the South. Despite the very intentional effort to produce more children born into slavery, they also were trying to get people from the North, capture them and take them south. This changed what we see in a lot of history, which was this is the point where people begin to really define people not by their status, whether they were freed or enslaved, but by the color of their skin. Because this law assumed that if you were a person of color, you came from or had been enslaved yourself, and you could get $1,000 fine, which was about 4 years of a woman's wages, if you were caught in any way helping someone. Those women that we introduced earlier were all a part of the anti-slavery movement. But being women, sometimes as they organized, they knew that they had to hide a little bit of what they were doing. So it would be an anti-slavery sewing society. So we could all get together and work around the quilt. And by the time we're working around our quilt, someone's going to be reading that history of women's suffrage or other documents to get us agitated and upset and excited so that we could then organize and attempt to make the social change that we wanted to make. The women's temperance unions were another movement that was founded in part because of the incredible incidence of alcoholism that was a part of the United States economy. Rochester put $2 million into the tills of its cash registers in 1900, specifically the cash registers of the bars and liquor stores here. Women's temperance or temperance. So what's confusing, it's not about having women stop drinking. It was mostly about having everyone stop drinking. It was an issue for women who were victimized by domestic violence, because we know substance abuse and domestic violence go hand in hand. And in the 19th century, Jane Doe marries Fred Smith, and the law says Jane Doe no longer exists in the eyes of the law. She is Mrs. Fred Smith. So not being a legal entity, she can't enter a contract. She can't have a bank account. She can't be employed and collect her wage. The wage goes to him. If she's in an abusive relationship and leaves, she can't rent a space because she's married, and she can't do that without permission from her husband. She can't take his children because the law says they're his. So it was an issue for women. I'm covering some of this background because I want us to get a sense about these amazing women and how brave they really were and how they were really taking on the institutions of society for different reasons. Sometimes, like Sojourner Truth, they were radicalized by the circumstance of their life. Not much to lose, and so you fight for what you believe in. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper would have lost more than gained by being engaged. It was that of Susan B. Anthony and Mary, they just couldn't see something that was wrong and not be compelled to try to change it. Well, one of the things that's happening in society is these rebellions and starting to change the world. And then we come into the Civil War. And the Civil War has a number of different impacts. Anybody know which state lost the most people in the Civil War? New York. The other states that had some of the highest casualties in the Civil War were Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Ohio. These also become some of the places where we see feminism emerging and opportunities for nursing and for women to be engaged in other professions. Well, realistically, it's a fact. 2% of the male population dies, and they happen to be the youngest, most vital ones. So there's a disproportion of women to men in society. Well, that provided a certain amount of opportunity for women. Dorothea Dix, during the Civil War, most of us know Dorothea Dix more for her work in establishing mental asylums and believing that there should be better services for people who were poor, and for her work in prisons. She was appointed to be the head of the nurses during the American Civil War. I read in Wikipedia, just because I wanted to see what people were saying, that she wasn't very good at that job. Now, if you read in the history of women's suffrage, what Stanton and Gage and Anthony will tell you is, of course she wasn't. She was put in charge of all of the nurses in the army who were male. As a woman, she was not allowed to teach them. She was not allowed to speak to them, and she was not allowed to give them directions. But she was in charge of them. So enter now a whole host of women who want to serve and take care, because more people are dying from disease than from injury in the war. And a lot of the male nurses were not as excited about the dysentery and the malaria and the diseases that you should get. And we have folks like Clara Barton, who's organizing and taking many of the methods that Florence Nightingale has developed around sanitation, around wound care, around principles of health and hygiene, and taking those out into the war front and caring for people in the field. Now, there were many people who had some skill in healing and nursing in the 19th century where we wouldn't expect. Those were people who had been enslaved. Two ways for a woman to gain a certain amount of status and also protection when she was enslaved were to be an excellent seamstress, because that was a skill that was deeply wanted on the plantation. And another was to be an effective healer. It also meshed with people who were often on the edge of starvation and frequently wounded and suffering at the hands of those who were their owners, for others to learn skills at nursing and care for people and healing. So there were many who were practicing what was almost, in effect, like homeopathic nursing. And there were many Black women in the South who were quite skilled in the arts of healing and caring for other people. Now, as Susan B. Anthony begins her life by the 1860s, when they're living here, when her two sisters are dying of tuberculosis, Guelma and then Hannah, they move home with their whole family, so Mary and Susan can take care of them here. And there really isn't a professional nurse available much for that care. Susan and Mary and the family are doing the care. They're doing the bedside care, the cleaning, and the care. In the cities that are growing in the 19th century across the country, issues like dysentery, disease are becoming more and more problematic. Water is not clean. In some places, the beer is a lot healthier to drink than the water, particularly in the mid-Atlantic states. There are all kinds of strange practices that people have. Actually, some of them have proven, like using leeches, to be effective in some treatment of illness. But there's bloodletting and all kinds of other treatment that are going on. Two professions that were open to women in the 19th century were teaching and nursing. But nursing wasn't standardized. So nursing could be anything from helping a person at bedside. You could have skills or not have skills, training or not have training. You might be paid or not paid. But the Civil War gave this opportunity because women were needed and were volunteering. In many cases, those who worked with Clara Barton and others, many of the middle-class white women, paid for themselves to be out there in the service of others. They supported their own work and what they were doing. What the feminists saw and what they articulated was this was a huge opportunity, because there were people who thought that women didn't really have an executive center. There were people who thought if you exercised this organ, it would impact the ability of these organs when you needed them later. That was what Susan B. Anthony was told when her teacher would not teach her long division when she was 11 years old. It would be a waste. She wouldn't have a talent. During the Civil War, the women who developed skills and demonstrated their administrative skills, their organizing skills, and their skills in nursing changed the attitude of those people who saw the effectiveness of their work. They were in demand, they were needed, and they were darn good at it. And Susan B. Anthony and others saw this as an opportunity that this profession, because it was open to women, could be the profession that could most demonstrate that women could succeed as professionals in the world. Now, there are a lot of laws. There were 26 states that said you couldn't have a profession if you were married. You had to quit teaching. You had to quit nursing. You couldn't work if you were married. There were other concerns. If you were to go into nursing, as the nursing schools began to start, they were usually, as they were here in Rochester, situations where you got your training by living at the hospital, at the facility. Educate was one of the first strategies that they had in all of the feminist movements. To educate, to learn as much as we could, to be as effective, to earn the respect, and also to get people interested and excited about what the opportunities were that could be in front of them. Well, this is the space that's Mary's office. This was where Guelma and Hannah were both nursed. One, they were dying from tuberculosis. It's where Clara Barton is featured over Mary's desk, because Clara and Mary worked together, and Mary was a volunteer with Clara Barton. And also, for just those of you who are in Rochester, which might not be all the folks, it's all of you, at least for the moment, but who are on camera. Rochester is the second American Cross organization in this country. Dansville was the first. Rochester is the second. And according to the American Red Cross, those papers were written right here in Mary's office. The next piece is to agitate, and that's to get people excited, to get them concerned, and to get them engaged. And that's what things like the history of women's suffrage was all about. And that's why they were speaking across the country also. To get people, if people were too complacent as they're sitting in their middle-class homes, for Susan B. Anthony, when she was an agent for the New York State Anti-Slavery Society, it was to get people in the North engaged in the horrific problems that were happening in the South. It was to awaken people to be concerned about what the country was engaged in, to agitate. Well, before the Civil War, in Philadelphia, the Nurse Society was formed, and they began to train women, particularly in caring for women, which had often been done in the home or in other places. By the later 19th century, women who have a certain privilege in class are so distressed that a man might violate portions of their body that they will not seek treatment and care from a male doctor, lest they be indiscreet or compromised in some way. So one of the great motivators about women getting into the medical profession and into nursing was to take care of women. Emily and Elizabeth Blackwell, who opened the Women's College in New York City, were particularly concerned about training doctors who could understand women's bodies and women's situations, but also serving those. We already talked about the importance of the Civil War, but it was the service by Civil War nurses that really set up the rationale for having more training programs. People could see the effectiveness of good training. They could see the effectiveness of skills. They could see how much more could be done if people really knew what they were doing. And so similar courses began to be offered. And here in Rochester, City Hospital is formed around the time of the Civil War. Now, if you were to walk down Madison and turn left, you go past the Anthony Square Apartments. City Hospital sat right there. So when the 15 Rochester women went to vote in 1872, they walked right by City Hospital. City Hospital originally to care for those who were wounded in the Civil War. But a very significant and important part because, and you can see, so right here we've got We've got St. Mary there. You can see at City Hospital, the big green piece there. And Madison Park, you can see is by Madison Street. So right there with City Hospital. So Susan marched right by it on a regular basis. Rochester City Hospital established a training school for nursing. That was really established by 1880. There had been a continuing push for more training and for more consistent training. And Susan B. Anthony is one of those who says, you'll get more respect for the profession if you have consistent training and people can rely on consistent behaviors and skills from folks who are involved in it. We were the third program in New York State, but it was the first in Rochester, and it used the Florence Nightingale model for training. Many women came right after grade school, were in the hospital situation, learned the skills, and also it worked out pretty well for the hospital because they had skilled and trained nurses and mostly fed them rather than paid for them. But they had skills in bandaging, they had skills in bed making, massage, special diets, and general housekeeping, as well as tending to the wounded and to wounds. But remember, we're still developing things like we don't have antibiotics available. We have ether, but not much for an anesthesia. And so often it's horrific, courageous work to be tending to people who are healing, recovering, or those who are dying. And there were significant risks involved. Tuberculosis would be a good example. And so these women were believing in what they were doing and the impact that it could have for those around them. I always think there's such a natural connection between suffragists and their sense of vocation and nurses and their sense of vocation. They had a weekly lecture for medical doctors and practical instruction from the head nurse as a part of their training. And this worked quite well for quite a while. There's the first two graduating classes of folks that came out of City Hospital. And you can do more research about these particular people. It's great fun. I always mentioned then William Ely was really important in developing the training program and also believed in structuring the nursing training in ways that it could really elevate the profession. The American Journal of Nursing follows and is founded right here in Rochester and becomes the most important journal for the nursing profession around the country, where it is the official voice of the American Nurses Association. And it was designed as a professional document to continue the training and the education and the agitation around professional nursing. Susan B. Anthony has some wonderful quotes. This was actually after she was denied the jury at her trial for voting in 1873. But if we ever wonder about the radical feminists, I think this makes it pretty clear that Susan says, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. What we see in so many of the emerging nursing training places and the public nurse happening is people who are responding to the needs of the public, going into impoverished areas where disease is running rampant, teaching people in major urban centers like New York and Chicago, Philadelphia and Boston about what the importance of fresh air, the importance of sanitation, the importance of plumbing, being engaged in making such significant improvements in how people live and function in our society today that we would now take for granted. But it came out of the wisdom of the nursing profession. The Rochester Homeopathic Hospital gets formed in 1887, in part by the Harper Sibley family's funding. And Rochester is now becoming a pretty popular place for nursing as well. The homeopaths connecting with some of the art of healing and the idea they try to treat the whole body, not necessarily the particular symptom. Sophia French Palmer is a name that most folks who studied nursing history are familiar with. She ends up in Rochester after having been several other places and teaching, and she becomes an amazing leader in innovations for nursing education. And not too far away, we've got also Eva Allerton, who comes to the Homeopathic Hospital. I apologize, I got that crossed. But not too far away, we have Sylvie Nye in Buffalo. And those three women are incredible third generation feminists who are agitating for the nursing profession. She gets the School of Nursing at the Homeopathic Hospital incorporated, and they've got a vision now. If we could get the state to regulate the profession of nursing so that you couldn't just put out a shingle and say, I'm a nurse. But anyone who did say they were a nurse would then, you would know that they'd had the training and the skills, and that would up the profession. And in particular, Susan B. Anthony thought that everyone who was going to put out a shingle as a nurse should have that quality of education, and that would be the best thing for the profession. So they begin to advocate for a thing in New York State called the Nurse Practice Act, or the Armstrong Act. In 1899 is when they first call for it. But we get all the way to 1902 until the nurses from the state of New York are having their convention right here in Rochester. And on the docket is the question about whether they want to endorse the Nurse Practice Act or not. And they bring in Susan B. Anthony as their keynote speaker. At 82, she takes a break from her suffragist work, and she stays all day. She gives a keynote address where she says this needs to happen because you will gain the respect of people when this profession is elevated to the level it deserves. And I love Susan's quote about women must not depend upon the protection of man, but must be taught to protect herself. A lot of the growth in the medical profession for women and in nursing was related to the fact that women needed care and that children needed care. It was the way to address, in the United States, you still often died. We say that the average lifespan was 43, but that's not a number that was reality. You either died in the childhood diseases, or if you're a woman, you died in childbirth, or you lived to a ripe old age. And 43 was just the average. And as cities were expanding in the industrial age, we see people who are trapped in horrific living situations. So some of these women were so engaged in addressing those impossible social woes of that time. So Susan speaks, and they vote at that convention to endorse the Armstrong Act, and it gets through the New York legislature, just a little bit behind another state. So it wasn't the first state to develop registered nursing, but it was one that was leading the way all along. And now think, from the 1850s and the 1860s, when those early feminists already had said this is an opportunity for women to excel and demonstrate a profession and exceed all expectations, we get all the way to 1902 before we're getting professional acknowledgement of the profession of nursing. Marcina Sherman Riker, who was Susan B. Anthony's physician, she was trained as a homeopathic doctor, was first a nurse here in Rochester. And that's very significant. We do see women working their way through medical training. But Margaret Shanks, by the time Susan's dying upstairs on the second floor, she had two nurses who were registered nurses who had graduated from nursing programs here in Rochester. And so unlike the way she had cared for her sisters, she had professional nursing in her final days. Her doctor was Marcina Riker, and she had benefited herself. There was one point when Mary gets upset because Margaret apparently was quite a fundamentalist, and Susan had trouble with her religious doctrine. Mary had trouble with her religious doctrine, and Mary shared that with Susan, and Susan says, care at the bedside is all that matters. My nurses are without exception. So kind of fun. And Margaret Shank was still living in 1945 and wrote about her experience of being Susan B. Anthony and then Mary's nurse later in life. We know that Sylvine Nye from Buffalo came to visit. This is October of 1905. So 3 years after the Nurse Practice Act has passed. She's signing in at the guest book at the Susan B. Anthony Museum. I would have loved to have known what the conversation was, and perhaps we will uncover that conversation at some point in a letter that has yet to be read from the context and perception of nursing history. Well, I think what Susan had in common with those who were early advocates for the nursing profession was this idea that there were wrongs to be righted, there were people to be healed, there were wonderful lessons to be shared, and that's what compelled her. And that's what compelled the radical feminists to drive for the respect and honoring the profession of nursing that we have today. Thank you. Questions? And then I have facts so I can look up if you ask me. So some could jump in who might know more. So it varied. And so yes, thank you. Joan asked, did it cost them to go through a nursing training program? And how did they have the money to do it? One of the reasons that we see people, Margaret Shanks was a young immigrant from Scotland. Often you would get bed and board from the hospital, but you were expected to serve the patients. It developed so that sometimes you could also get a stipend or a wage. And we see, welcome, Martha. We see that happen over the years. You'll see different, pretty much hospitals would maintain that. This is a theory for as long as they could. So it was an opportunity for women who might not have been able to pay for education beyond basic grammar school to get into a profession. No, if they were married, they would not be welcome to the program. It was a 24-hour-a-day training experience, and you were expected to live on site, and you were expected to not have any other competition. 3 years, isn't it 3 years? Yeah. A 2-year program I know was the Nightingale model. And I've also read about 3-year programs, but then you could stay on as a nurse until you got married. And then you would usually lose the opportunity. And as I mentioned, I mentioned my own bias. What we see a lot of in the early radical feminists in the 19th century is that we see a lot of lesbians for a couple of reasons. One, because if you are a woman and you have to support yourself, you want to look for professions where you can succeed and have meaning. The other was that the disproportionate male to females after the Civil War made it actually easier for some women to cohabitate with other women. They were considered spinsters, and that actually provided an opportunity for women who were interested in a lot of some of the women that in the arts, in professions, in reading, writing, a lot of the other tours. So it was the Civil War provided opportunity in a number of different ways.
I'd love to know if you could find out there are laws about who attended the nursing school in the hospital, because I have a great aunt who became the erotic nurse around the 1920s, and I just came upon her logs. They're in the Edward G. Minor Library, and they're just blowing me away. But it'd be nice to know she was trained there.
It would be. So the question was, are there logs or lists of students and all that? So we fortunately have and love to partner with the Rochester Medical Archives. They have most of the records from the hospitals, from the homeopathic hospital, Highland Hospital, and their nurse training program, City Hospital. And often, especially with women's history, what we discover is because somebody has a question and goes and finds other things that we had missed before. And so I encourage you to contact the medical archives and see what they might have. Frequently, right now, there's a huge turnover of baby boomers who are selling properties and finding shoeboxes full of letters and things in the attic. Don't think that old stuff might not be of interest to someone. We, particularly around women's history, one of the best ways for us to learn about women's history is through correspondence. Unfortunately, for some of our history of women in color, because it was illegal for a child of color to learn how to read and write, and because you could go to jail if you were caught doing so. Fortunately, we have some oral history and some tapestry and fabric history that tells those stories. But if you find a typed letter that's signed by Susan B. Anthony, you should keep it. If you want to call us, we'll tell you how to take care of it for years. It's a treasure and you should love it. There are tens of thousands of them out there. She was prolific.
So where would you go for the archives?
Rochester Medical Archives. They are at the, what's the right name of the Rochester Academy of Medicine on East Avenue. It's a beautiful building. And you can go there and talk to Kathleen Britton. And we, for a while, had some wonderful volunteers that were volunteers here and there. And actually, a whole lot of our development of the nursing history was a joint project between what was not called the Rochester Medical Archives when we started, but it's a huge treasure. Huge treasure.
Spirits,
Question about George Eastman providing support for any of the hospitals that trained the women. I don't know the answer to that question. He certainly provided support for the University of Rochester, which didn't open its doors to women until 1900. But I don't know about that's. I do not know the answer to that question. It's an interesting piece. Emily and Elizabeth Blackwell were both trained physicians who were from that earlier group. Antoinette Brown Blackwell, we tend to know more, who was another generation, was one of the first women ordained in Rochester. The Blackwell sisters were both trained in medicine in Ohio. After they got their medical degrees, they could find nowhere to practice because the men who were in practice would run them out of town and discredit them. So from that, they went to New York City and started a public health nursing program and then started their own medical college. And they did get it. They got a charter through the Board of Regents. And they continued that medical college, which specifically trained women and was one of the only places that a woman who was being trained in medicine or in nursing could have women on the faculty. And so they had some real wonderful opportunities for research there. That then folded after Cornell opened a program that was teaching medicine in New York City and welcomed women.
You know what I'm going to ask?
I don't know what you're going to ask.
Did you find much evidence of Mary's role in work with the nursing training programs and have you found any information about
So the question was, did we find anything about Mary's role in the training of the nurses? And did we find anything more about the Red Cross in Rochester? So I would go to Mary's role. So I would go to Christine Radarski. She's the city historian who's done a tremendous amount of research into Mary. And I don't know that we have found new stuff, but I think it's a rich treasure trove. That is, the reality is that so much of women's history is just brand new in terms of opening it up and looking at it through the lenses. But I do.
No, I'm looking for it, so we found something.
You can be part two.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Mary, Mary, who actually owned the house, not Susan. If she hadn't had this kind of famous big sister, would have been Rochester's local hero. Her work with the Women's Educational Industrial Union, her work in public education, her work in getting nursing and nurses into public schools, in getting safe milk stations, in always championing that to tax a woman who owned property was taxation without representation. And we weren't yet fulfilling our democratic ideal. In fact, there's a story from Margaret Shanks when Mary died of lymphoma about a year after Susan, which was a very difficult end of life. Mary, every year when she paid her taxes at 17 Madison Street, would take her payment downtown and she would protest. This is taxation without representation. And it was well known. It would be published in the newspapers. Mary has made her protest. Mary Anthony has made her protest. And Margaret Shanks wrote and said, when Mary was dying, it came to me to take her payment downtown. And there were tears in the tax collector's eyes when he realized Mary couldn't make her protest herself.
Her papers.
Margaret's. I don't know what, I know that the Medical Archives has history of what class she was in, and she actually wrote the alma mater for that nursing program that's still sung by some today who are part of that tradition of nursing. So I assume that they have more extensive archive, and what we have is just letters related to when we started the museum, and some newspapers.
I have a question, that picture you have on the screen.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll never forget that day and the lines to put stickers on your gravestones. Are people still doing that? Ever go there? I haven't.
Sue's asking because of the picture, which is from the 2016 election.
Is it near once? I couldn't remember.
Yeah, this is the day after the election, after it had rained. Asking if people,
Thousands of people.
10,000 people is what the city estimated. People do still go. You can now put your sticker along with all the other stickers onto acrylic cover so that it doesn't put all that glue and adhesive onto the gravestones. And people, we still have people from other states send us their sticker to put it on their behalf.
Some of the objects you see in this picture, we've actually preserved those, so they're in the city historian's collection now. We put some of them on display periodically.
I'm glad
I
to
see,
hear
I
that.
see several things in there that I have in the collection.
And
It
it,
was quite the day, and Frederick Douglass, of course, made so close.
I think in 2020 and in 2020, the Women's Vote New York State project, which is a website that we've now inherited from the project, featured grave sites across New York State and did filming on Election Day in 2020 for other graveyards that have suffragists. And the project is to encourage local communities to find out who the suffragists are, who were buried. Could be a similar one to find out who the early nurses were who were buried in your local gravesite and celebrate those people and honor them in Nursing Week in May. As we go honor Lillian Wald and her role in public health nursing up at Mount Hope Cemetery. So
Have a well-articulated question, but I'm a bit hung up on the financial sustainability of being a nurse.
Yeah.
If you're not being paid and sort of like, I don't want to say indentured servitude, but if you know, your labor is linked to your room and board in this way, at what point and how did that evolve away to being a profession that someone could use to sustain themselves and even support family?
good question. So we have nursing professionals in the room who might know more, but I think that similar conditions existed well into the early 1960s, where people were still paid. Yeah, go ahead, Marie.
I don't know what I'm talking about. I will say this, that I taught at some school. Very associated. So, doctor. Now,
Thank you.
it's interesting.
For those who are on virtually, Marie was sharing that even into the 1960s, there were still programs where you got room and board and the privilege of working. But it did provide great opportunities.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and
Now, there are many.
well, during World War I, trained nurses who wanted to volunteer and serve with the United States military were denied an opportunity to get a commission. So they went and enlisted in France. And actually, the suffrage movement suspended its work during World War I and supported some of the nursing that was happening on the battlefield. So interesting. Dude. Judy was sharing that when she graduated from a nursing program, which was a 4-year degree program in 1960, when those graduates would go out into the working world, they would be working alongside nurses who had been brought through the more traditional residential programs, and they would have had more exposure to people on the floors and the skills. And so that's interesting. You raised the great question. Even in the 19th century, the radical feminists observed that the two professions open to women were nursing and teaching, and they were the lowest paid professions. To me, it doesn't make any sense that a nurse makes any less than a physician. If anybody thinks the doctor can get you well alone, they've never been sick. So we still need to work for that. Thank you very much.
So again, thank you to Deborah for this wonderful presentation. Thank you all for joining us today in the room, and for those of you that are on Zoom. I do hope that we'll see all of you back in June. On June 11th, we will be having our final guest lecture, and we'll be welcoming Barbara Weisberg. Barbara will be talking about her latest book, Strong Passions, A Scandalous Divorce in Old New York. It is on sale in our visitor center in the shop if you're interested in picking up the book. So we'll be sending out some more information about that, but we're looking forward to Barbara's presentation, and the book touches on a lot of women's issues in the 1850s and 60s. So we hope we'll see you there. But again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much, Deborah.